Good morning, or afternoon, or evening. Although this conference looks to the future, I'd like to take a moment to look to the past, to the ways in which scholars at the turn of the 19th century understood the accessibility of medieval primary materials and the possibility that technology, in their case print, could be used to present texts to the public, to use an often repeated phrase. In the 1801 edition of the Specimens of the Early English Poets, George Ellis devotes a chapter to an examination of the surviving early Anglo-Norman manuscripts. Ellis concludes his chapter by making an explicit argument for the necessity of complete printed editions of early texts. But it is not sufficient that the mines of literature contained in our public libraries shall be distinctly pointed out, unless some steps are taken to render them generally useful. A printed copy of the works of the Norman poets would be a most valuable present to the public. And indeed, it is only in this shape that they can be very generally useful, because the difficulty of the old manuscript characters is a permanent tax on the ingenuity of each successive student. It is in every case a delay to the gratification of his curiosity, and the talent of deciphering obsolete characters is not necessarily attached to the power of profiting by the information which is concealed under them. Besides, a scarce and valuable manuscript cannot possibly be put into general circulation, and many learned men are necessarily debarred either by distance or by infirmity or by the present pressure and variety of their occupations from spending much time in those public repositories of learning to which the access has indeed been rendered easy, but could not be made convenient by the liberality of their founders. Ellis's description of the difficulties inherent in the study of medieval texts is uncannily familiar. Even when texts are accessible in public institutions, as Ellis emphasizes, they require expertise to decipher and often a considerable investment of time, both to examine given texts and to develop the necessary skills. Ellis presents the mediation of printed editions as a solution to these problems, a way of presenting material to the public in a manner that can be generally useful. Ellis was one of a number of learned men involved in the study and publication of what we would now call Middle English at the turn of the century, including Joseph Ritson and Walter Scott. They focused primarily on romances, and their work is described in some detail in Arthur Johnston's Enchanted Ground, Monica Santini's Impetus of Amateur Scholarship, and David Matthews' Making a Middle English. The availability of manuscripts in public libraries and public repositories of learning allowed men from a range of backgrounds to make themselves experts in early literature, if they had the time. Ritson, an atheist, vegetarian, and political radical, moved to London in 1775 and began a self-imposed program of research in the British Museum. He made himself an expert in the material and linguistic features of early texts and developed an extraordinary ability to establish the date of texts and the relationships between them, contributing a great deal to our early understanding of Middle English. This brought him briefly, before his death in 1803, into contact with George Ellis, at the time a member of Parliament representing the interests of slaveholders, a young Walter Scott, and many others. The public printed works from this period are mostly available digitally. Archival material, letters, records of requests in libraries, publishers' accounts, can be used to reconstruct their research in some detail, including what they were unable to publish. However, this material is now more than ever difficult to access. In addition to making the case for complete printed editions, Ellis used his specimens of the English poets to announce forthcoming works. Readers unable or unwilling to consult Harley 2253 in the British Museum would no longer have to rely on Warton's History of English Poetry for extracts from King Horn, as it would be included in Ritson's forthcoming collection of metrical romances. Similarly, while Warton includes extracts from King Alessander, attributing it to Adam Davy, upon the whole, it is certainly to be wished that some editor may be found who shall have the courage to decipher the obsolete manuscript and give it entire to the public. Such an editor was found. By the end of the third volume, Ellis could announce that he was happy in being able to add that our stock of ancient English literature is likely to be soon enriched by accurate editions of both these very interesting works, Sir Tristram and King Alessander. The former will be published under the direction of Mr. Walter Scott, and the latter by Mr. Park. Ritson's ancient English metrical romances, containing 12 complete texts and further complete text in the notes, was published in 1802. Walter Scott's Sir Tristram from the Auchinleck manuscript was published in 1804. Ellis's own Specimens of Early English Metrical Romances was published in 1805, containing prose paraphrases with extensive illustrative extracts. However, Park's King Alessander, like many other planned works in this period, was abandoned. As David Matthews establishes, 18th and early 19th century scholars of what we would now call Middle English operated outside institutional and disciplinary frameworks. For the development of the private clubs and societies that supported the publication of medieval texts later in the 19th century, as documented by Matthews. Those who hoped to publish printed editions needed to rely on either sales or patronage. Neither was forthcoming, limiting the ways in which Middle English texts could be published. One consequence of this dynamic was that the men involved often used their publications, as well as reviews in influential periodicals, to explicitly make the case for the desirability and necessity of reliable, complete editions. In 1806, Walter Scott used the publication of Ellis's romances as an opportunity to review both Ellis and Ritson's works together, and to once more make the case for complete editions. Defending the historical and literary importance of the metrical romances, he declares, "With such ideas of the importance of these ancient legends of chivalry, we are bound to express our gratitude to those by whose labors they have been drawn from the dusty and chaotic confusion of public libraries and presented to the public in legible and attainable shape. Without patronage or institutional support, potential editors must appeal to public taste, and Ellis's popularizing role becomes essential." Scott is cautiously optimistic. "We still desire, even the more, to see a genuine edition of these ancient poems. It is painful to reflect that they, with many unedited chronicles, the materials of our national history, are lying unhonored and unconsulted amid the rubbish of large libraries. The indifferent sale of Mr. Ritson's work may discourage individuals, but surely the object is worth the attention of the English universities." Scott's concern was well-founded. Shortly before this review appeared, Ellis had written to him, explaining that, despite their hopes, the success of Ritson's work has not been such as to seduce our booksellers, and so few of them are disposed to encourage the prospect of editing entire any future tales of the same sort, that Park seems to be perfectly cured of the prospect of editing the life of Alexander. Robert Southey, visiting Edinburgh and Scott in 1805, wrote to a friend that, "Were there any sale for such things, I would willingly add 3 more volumes to Ritson's, but these must be left to be done by future academies. Perhaps the London Institution may bestow some of its funds upon our national literature." One further attempt was made to publish a collection of romances by Henry Weber in 1810. This collection was the last attempt to realize the project that had seemed possible in 1801 and was recognized as untenable in 1805. In several cases, Weber relied upon the transcripts made earlier and provided to him by Ellis, most notably for King Alessander. 5 of the 10 romances included in the collection were complete editions of texts that had been transposed by Ellis. Weber positions his collection as the continuation of the work begun by Ritson. It is a second collection. Weber's collection was, as Matthews argues, an ill-fated project from the outset. Subscriptions were not forthcoming, Scott withdrew his support, and Weber struggled to find a publisher for a work of far more limited scope than his initial plans. He had collected far more material than he was able to publish. It was originally the wish of the editor to rescue all the ancient English romances, or at least all those which merit preservation for any reason whatever, from their present precarious existence in manuscript and difficult accessibility in public libraries. His description of printed editions as a way to rescue texts from libraries is a striking one. Editing texts preserves them, protects them from a precarious physical existence, makes them accessible, makes them useful. In the rest of this presentation, I would like to look at a few examples of the repercussions of texts to which access has indeed been rendered easy, but could not be made convenient in Ellis's formulation. The necessity of travel to access unique manuscripts complicated attempts to rescue texts. For example, King Alessander survives in 3 manuscripts, one in the Bodleian Library, one in the Library of Lincoln's Inn, and a fragment in the Auchinleck manuscript in Edinburgh. All these manuscripts were accessible to scholars, but not convenient. In July of 1801, Ellis wrote to Scott that he and Francis Douce had examined a transcript made from the Lincoln's Inn manuscript, and Park was compiling their notes. Scott offered a transcript of the Auchinleck fragment, which Ellis thought unnecessary, replying, "Our copy is complete, and does not, I think, require an improvement beyond what a collation with the Bodleian manuscript will furnish." Ellis underestimated differences between the manuscripts, and the work was delayed. In May of 1802, Ellis wrote to Scott to thank him for the transcripts of Merlin, observing the astonishing similarity of style, suggesting that King Alessander might be claimed as a Scottish text. It is well worth claiming, as you would have known long ere this, had it not been discovered by Haber that the Bodleian copy contained about 1,500 verses, more than that of Lincoln's Inn, which Park had transcribed, in consequence of which it will be necessary for him to repair to Oxford, which, being at present hard at work on some other subjects, he cannot conveniently do. I would argue that the cumulative effect of these delays pushed the publication of this edition outside of what, in hindsight, was a very short window within which such a work could be published. Moreover, Ellis's account reveals the collaboration and assistance upon which medieval scholarship relied in this period. Transcripts, which were often produced and circulated within a complex system of gifts and favors, could make texts accessible even when travel was impossible, though they introduced their own complications. However, Ellis's description deliberately obscures the often delicate implications of class. Ellis, Douce, and Haber were all, in different degrees, wealthy men who could indulge in scholarship, like book collecting, as a hobby, while Thomas Park was attempting to support himself as an antiquary and literary editor, and so needed to choose his projects carefully. Other works were fatally delayed, including Ritson's Caledonian Muse, the Scottish counterpart to his English anthology. A version of this was printed around 1785. However, Ritson delayed publication, making extensive revisions and additions, until a fire at the printing house destroyed most of the existing printed copies in 1794. Ritson continued to revise the work until, in 1801, possibly due to an introduction made by Walter Scott, he sent the hybrid work, consisting of large portions of both print and manuscript, to the Edinburgh publisher Constable. At the time of Ritson's death in 1803, the new work was only partially printed, and Constable abandoned the project. Binding together the newly printed sheets, Ritson's manuscript notes, and the older annotated printed pages, this hybrid manuscript circulated throughout the 19th century, until it was acquired by the Glaswegian collector Bernard Buchanan George. When his library was sold after his death in 1924, the Caledonian Muse was purchased by Ritson's biographer, Bertrand Bronson. Bronson's 1931 article provides the authoritative account of the history and contents of the revised edition. It is now held with Bronson's other papers relating to Ritson in the Beinecke Library at Yale. During my doctoral research, I identified several letters between Ritson's nephew and David Lang in the collections of the University of Edinburgh that I now believe shed new light on the influence of this unpublished work on 19th century Scottish scholarship. However, until I can find a way to examine the manuscript, I cannot develop this further. Some of the long delays that prevented the publication of the Caledonian Muse resulted from Ritson's commitment to consulting accessible but inconvenient texts. In 1793, Ritson wrote to George Peyton, the Scottish antiquary, informing him that he no longer considered Lord Hale's edition of a selection of texts from the Bannatyne manuscript accurate. While the earliest versions of the Caledonian Muse relied upon Lord Hale's, Bronson establishes that the revised copy demonstrates Ritson's examination of the manuscript in the Advocate's Library. Not all of Ritson's trips to Edinburgh were productive. The Chepman and Miller prints were acquired in 1788, and Ritson knew from bibliographic works that they contained material relevant to his research. However, as he explained in a note to his Robin Hood collection, all endeavors to procure a sight of or extract from it have proved unsuccessful, though the editor even took a journey to Edinburgh chiefly for the purpose, and received every possible degree of attention and civility from the worthy librarian, the book having been now detained out of the library for some years. Although he repeatedly wrote to his contacts in Edinburgh, asking them to check if it had been returned, Ritson was never able to consult the Chepman and Miller prints. Ritson's consultation of the Vernon and Maitland manuscript required further journeys to Oxford and Cambridge, which introduced further delays. Other journeys were simply never made. In an article documenting the 19th century discovery of the Thornton manuscript in Lincoln Cathedral, George Kaiser demonstrates that, although a volume of exceptional importance, the Thornton manuscript remained largely unnoticed until the second quarter of the 19th century. 18th century engagement with the manuscript largely relied upon Thomas Tanner's 1748 antiquarian catalogue, which included entries for some, but not all of the texts of the manuscript. The scholars at the turn of the 19th century were often very well aware that the manuscript contained material very relevant to their research, but, with the exception of Ritson, were unwilling or unable to make the journey to Lincoln. Kaiser provides a brief account of Richard Haber's unsuccessful attempt to borrow the manuscript on behalf of Ellis, recorded in Frederick Madden's diary 3 decades later. It's always fascinating to me that Madden solicited and recorded these stories about an earlier generation. To this can be added Ellis's report to Scott in a letter from February 1802. Haber's attempt to borrow the manuscript had failed, and it will therefore be necessary that, for the purpose of saying wise things upon the subject, you should obtain a sight of the manuscript when you pass through Lincoln, which you will do, of course, in your way to the south, partly for the purpose of discovering the purpose for which the devil thought it necessary to look over the town, and partly with a view to avoid the vulgar rectilinear mode of traveling, pursued by those who forget that a road constructed for the general object of internal commerce cannot be suited to the objects of enlightened wanderers. As to myself, instead of accepting the dean's permission of carrying Mahomet to survey the mountains, I am quite determined to believe, in despite of the dean and the devil, that the mountains are not worth looking at, and that Percival is either a very dull or a very modern romance. As Ellis had warned in his work of the year before, if texts were not convenient, they would not be consulted. Ellis here presents a vision of antiquarian research as a hobby, an idiosyncratic sort of tourism, enlightened rather than commercial, a respectable activity for a gentleman. The simple inconvenience of a trip to Lincoln explains the otherwise inexplicable absence of texts that we might expect to see addressed in the early 19th century scholarship, given their stated interests. The struggles and accomplishments of the turn of the century scholars remind us that accessibility is not binary, and that inconvenience could determine which texts were and were not presented to the public. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.